When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart lurched, not because I feared some cinematic exposure, but because of those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I reached for the phone, a reflex born from years of tidying loose ends, but he leaned back and kept reading. I watched his face shift line by line, a slow weather front rolling across the features I've known half my life, and I felt the scaffolding of my small, quiet world tremble. Yes, he would see the truth now. But not the whole truth. His hand shook as he scrolled, and I understood he was nearing the one message that would decide the story we tell about us. The one that could close the book with a heavy, resentful thud, or leave the pages open, corners turned down by mercy. My phone suddenly buzzed in his grip, a new notification glowed on the screen. I watched the blood drain from his face when he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, the old habit from school days, a private anchor when I felt adrift. The nerves mingled with the cold admission of what I had done. His breathing grew shallow, even from across the room I heard it, a thin, uneven saw through the silence. This was the exact moment I had rehearsed away in my mind and still failed to prevent. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the kind that rearranges furniture in your life while you sleep. And now, I didn't know what to do next. But let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I worked so carefully to hide, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer one more question. Have you ever held a secret with both hands, only to feel it slip through your fingers the moment someone said your name? The day my husband left for his trip, a hot wind pushed the curtains against the window like a chest refusing to breathe. He kissed my forehead the way he always does when he's already thinking of the gate number, the weather in another city, the chain of meetings ahead. I love him. I do. Love, in our house, lives like the reliable tick of the hallway clock, not dramatic, not loud, a faithful metronome. What we echo, after nearly 3 decades, is competence and shared history. We have quilts we sewed together in winter and an arrangement of mugs he always insists should face the same direction on the shelf. There's comfort in that symmetry. But comfort can be a thin blanket when you wake at 3 a.m. and the room has turned to ocean. When he closed the door behind him, the house inhaled and held it. I moved through the rooms like an inspector, adjusting frames, folding the towels, busy hands recreating what stability looks like. In the kitchen, the fruit bowl leaned toward abundance. I washed the grapes even though I was the only one home. The kettle trilled, and I poured water over the tea as if time could be steeped into patience. I didn't plan for anyone else to be part of that morning. But lives bend for the small coincidences, doors open when you're sure you've locked them. He arrived with a rented car that looked too new for our dusty street, a suitcase scuffed as if it had visited countries it wanted to forget. 24, he said, almost apologetically, like an age could offend a room. He was my husband's colleague's nephew. No, that's too clean. He was the kind of guest you agree to take because saying no feels like refusing a future kindness, because your home has always been the place with an extra set of linens, because someone once made room for you. He stood on the porch with a polite smile and the careful posture of a person weighing their welcome in ounces. I told him to come in. My voice sounded composed, even to me. The air shifted when he stepped across the threshold. Not perfume or cologne, youth, maybe, that warm, bright smell of sun on cotton. I showed him the guest room we rarely use, the careful bedspread, the one reading lamp that hums if you listen. He thanked me in a low voice and said he'd keep out of the way. His words were neat, his eyes open without swagger. I noted the small callus near his thumb, the kind people earn from holding on to things, guitar strings or stubborn lids. I looked away before it became noticing. The first hour was choreography, the rattle of his suitcase wheels, the soft thud of drawers accepting a stranger's shirts, the clink of a glass filled at our kitchen sink. I offered coffee. He asked for tea. We both laughed, some nervous compromise of hospitality and humility. The window over the sink framed the day like a postcard, a sky too blue to be subtle. I asked how long he would stay. "A few days," he said, "until I find a room closer to the center." City logistics, that neutral territory, let us talk without saying anything. He told me he was here for a short-term project. He said spreadsheets like a person who also likes handwriting his lists. I told him where the bus stop was, which bakery forgets to count a croissant, where the park starts looking like a memory in late afternoon. I thought of my husband in an airport chair reading emails. I pictured the slope of his shoulders, a map I could draw from memory. What I cannot map is absence, the way rooms change when no one laughs from them, the way you hold two feelings in the same pocket, love and hunger, and neither one spills out. In the afternoon, the heat softened its grip. I wiped the kitchen table as if it had confessed to some mess it hadn't made. He came in with a small plant in a paper pot, something bright and determined. "For the windowsill," he said. "My aunt always brings one when she visits people." He placed it carefully, like an apology and a claim in one. I wanted to say we didn't need more life in this house, but that would have been the kind of joke that tells on you. Instead, I thanked him and asked what it was. He didn't know. We laughed again, this time without the nervous string. Evening approached in that patient way it has in summer, refusing to turn the page until every line of light has been read. I moved through the small tasks that are really rituals, laying out cutlery, wiping the stove, opening the window a crack to invite breeze and distant voices. He offered to cook, and I shook my head, then nodded, unsure what hospitality looks like when you feel observed. He chopped vegetables deftly while I found the good pan I reserve for dinners that want to be remembered. We didn't talk much. Sometimes the surface of conversation is best left unbroken, sometimes meaning finds you in the pauses. His sleeves were rolled just enough to reveal a faint ink at his wrist, a line, maybe, or a word that disappeared beneath fabric. The domesticity pressed close, the pan's sizzle, the lemon's brightness, the almost music of forks set down with care. After we ate, I washed the dishes slowly, pressing the sponge into each curve as if I could scrub my thoughts to order. He dried and stacked them with the reverence of a library clerk. When we finished, he thanked me again, unnecessary and kind. I told him to rest. He said he might take a short walk. The street outside was turning to honey. He left, and I stood at the door longer than a farewell requires. It's not that I expected anything. Expectation is louder than I can afford. It's that the day had taken on a tilt, and I was trying to stand straight. Alone again, I drifted into our bedroom. The bed looked too made, like a hotel's idea of comfort. I sat and felt the mattress receive me with the familiarity of a long marriage, supportive, known. My phone lay on the nightstand, a small, bright world begging to be held. I thought of the messages my husband and I exchange, practical, dotted with weather reports and reminders, kindness hidden in logistics. I wrote him that the plant looked brave on the sill, that the guest was polite, that the heat would break tomorrow. I didn't write that the quiet had a new temperature. I didn't write that my body felt like a room someone had just opened after years. I took a shower, and the water threaded through my hair with a patience I hadn't offered myself in ages. In the mirror, I looked like myself and a woman I used to know. I chose a cotton dress that didn't ask to be noticed and yet felt honest on my skin. As I brushed my hair, a memory approached, being 25 and stepping into a cafe where the door tinkled and everything seemed possible. I'm not 25. I know that. But the body carries echoes, a hallway remembers footsteps long after the visitor is gone. He returned with a paper bag that held nothing but the smell of oranges. They were on sale, he said, and placed them on the counter. We ate them standing up, the juice bright as advice. He told me about a busker who made the street sound like Saturday, even on a Tuesday. I told him about the neighbor who whistles as if practicing happiness and somehow gets better at it. A breeze lifted the curtain, and the room exhaled. Night thickened. He thanked me for the day in the old-fashioned way young people sometimes keep, as if politeness were a vintage he liked to pour slowly. He said goodnight at the hallway's fork, the part of the house that makes two paths from one decision. I nodded and watched him disappear into the guest room, the door closing with that careful hush people reserve for libraries and houses not yet theirs. In bed, I listened to the house reacquaint itself with night, the plumbing's whispered negotiations, the roof's soft stretch, the fridge humming a lullaby off-key. I thought of my husband 2 time zones away, the light of his hotel room a different color than ours. I pictured him placing his watch on the nightstand, lining up tomorrow as he always does, shirt, notes, plan. I am grateful for his order, for our weathered tenderness. Gratitude does not cancel longing, it sits beside it, both hands in its lap. I closed my eyes and counted the breath in and the breath out, the way a swimmer times waves to slip beneath them. Sleep took the room first, setting everything down just so, then it reached for me, gentle and insistent. Before I surrendered, I registered a faint sound through the wall, paper turning, perhaps, or a zipper guided slowly, the small, private music of someone else's presence. It was not a call. It was not a promise. It was a simple proof that the house, for the moment, held more than one story. By morning, I told myself I would have redrawn the boundaries. I would be the woman who puts the mugs facing the same way and waters the plant on the sill and writes her husband about the weather he will walk into. I would be that version of order again. And yet, as the dark thinned, I felt a bright thread tug at the hem of my composure, a stitch I could ignore if I chose. I did not choose yet. I only acknowledged the pull and let the night finish its quiet work. Morning arrived with a clean, pale light that made the house look newly painted, as if someone had come overnight to buff the edges of my life. I woke earlier than usual, the way you wake when a guest is staying under your roof and your responsibilities feel like small bells tied to your wrists. The hallway air was cooler than the bedroom, holding the faint, green smell of the little plant he had brought. In the kitchen, I set the kettle on and watched the thin plume rise, the steam making a soft ghost of the window. I moved with deliberate care, as if a camera were on me and the instructions were to be ordinary. It's harder than it sounds to be ordinary when you are paying attention. He appeared in the doorway with quiet steps, the kind that respect thresholds. He said good morning with a voice still braided with sleep. The greeting landed in the room like a coin on a table, simple, metallic, real. I poured hot water into 2 mugs without asking and set one near his hand. He thanked me and stood for a moment, taking in the day beyond the glass, the empty street, the single runner crossing the far end like a line drawn by resolve. The house felt companionable, as if its elbows had found ours. I am old enough to know that attraction, like weather, doesn't ask permission. It arrives, it tests the shutters, it rearranges afternoon plans. I kept my shoulders square and my attention divided between the kettle and a slice of bread whose pale surface wanted heat. He leaned against the counter, not too close, and told me about an early email confirming his project's start date. The way he said it suggested work that was both necessary and provisional, like scaffolding around something he hoped would one day stand on its own. I nodded and asked practical questions, bus lines, office hours, whether he minded the guest room's stubborn lamp. The conversation stayed in that safe register, but under it, some bass note gathered. By mid-morning, I found small tasks to keep the rhythm steady, laundry sorted into tolerant heaps, a drawer that always caught on one bad screw finally tightened, the basil on the windowsill pinched to coax more leaves. He offered to help and I waved him off, then pointed him toward the loose slat on the porch step. I listened to the careful rhythm of his effort, pry, pause, tapis, test. It sounded like someone thinking with their hands. My husband also fixes things, but he does it with a kind of brisk decisiveness that leaves no fingerprints. This was different. It wasn't better or worse, it was simply different, and difference has a way of throwing familiar shapes into relief. Around noon, the heat pressed down with a palm. We ate a simple lunch, eggs folded into themselves, tomatoes that tasted of the same sun lighting the table. We spoke about the city. I traced bus routes in the air, and he traced back paths from train stations to bookstores, to a community pool that keeps odd hours, to a cafe where the owner substitutes stories for receipts. He had a knack for naming small places the way some people name constellations. It made the map of my own town feel newly annotated, as if there had always been a layer I had failed to peel. In the early afternoon, the house became the kind of warm that sends thought into shade. I retreated to the bedroom with a fan and a book whose spine had long since surrendered. I didn't read much. Words moved across the page as if they'd put on slippers to keep from waking something. I drifted in and out of nap and memory, a younger self on a train, a green dress, a station where the air always smelled faintly of oranges. When I opened my eyes, the fan hummed a compromise with the heat, and from down the hall I heard the low murmur of his phone call, a polite, professional tone that made me think of doors opening in buildings I would never enter. Later, when the sun angled low, I stepped into the hallway and nearly collided with him. He had the startled, open laugh of someone who forgives a clumsy ballet. I steadied myself on the doorframe and told him the park would be kind to us at this hour. He said he could use the walk. We left the house in that late-day light that smooths even the unflattering corners of a street. The air tasted different outside, a little metallic, like a spoon tapped against glass. We walked without urgency, the way you walk when the point is not arrival but the space your feet make between thoughts. In the park, the pond held the sky like an obedient mirror. Children's voices arced and fell. A dog trotted with shabby grandeur, as if confidence were a coat. We sat on a bench in the shade. He asked about the years I used to work in an office downtown, and I told him about lunches eaten on a windowsill, about the old elevator that had to be coaxed with a palm on its panel. I said I left when leaving made more sense than staying, and he nodded with the seriousness of someone collecting other people's reasons for future use. I asked about his project. He told me enough to respect confidentiality without weaponizing vagueness. He spoke with a hopeful exactness I remembered from a time when I could see the path ahead without squinting. I have a good life, I know that. I am not looking to cancel gratitude. But sitting there, my knees mapped by dappled light, I felt both older and wider, like a river slowed by breath. A breeze found us and sifted the heat. He turned his face into it with a closed-lid contentment that felt unguarded. I looked away, not because it embarrassed me but because I have learned to ration my glances. We looped the outer path once more and headed home along the quieter streets. A neighbor waved from her porch with a conspiratorial lift of the chin that somehow implies both greeting and inquiry. I lifted a hand in return and kept walking. The house was leveled with a fresh stillness when we returned, the rooms briefly surprised by us again. On the kitchen counter, the plant he had brought stood with a sturdiness I envied. I poured 2 glasses of water, and we drank like people who had earned it. Evening set its slow table. I pulled from the fridge what would become supper, a handful of vegetables, a piece of fish, a lemon that brightened the air just by being cut. He asked if he could slice the peppers and I nodded, moving aside. We worked in an easy parallel, the conversation fitting itself around the kitchen's geometry. I told him the story of the oven's one hot spot and how I learned to turn pans a quarter at a time. He told me about a teacher who had a bowl of clementines on her desk and never once refused a student who reached for one. We ate at the table without candles or ceremony. The food was good because we were hungry, and hunger is the best spice that never runs out. After dinner, I stacked plates near the sink while he carried the trash out and returned with the scent of the evening on his shirt. The sky outside shifted to that deepening blue you can feel in your teeth. He mentioned the veranda and I agreed before the word finished leaving his mouth. We brought out 2 chairs and a light blanket, more for the ritual than the temperature. Street lamps blinked on with a soft dawning, the neighborhood deciding, together, to become a nocturne. We sat and let the world reduce itself to the sounds that can be heard when no one insists on talking: a bicycle chain, a lullaby from a second-floor window, a distant train stamping time. He asked me, quietly, whether I ever missed the person I thought I might become and didn't. It was a question that understood its own trespass yet asked anyway. I turned it over in my mind before answering. I told him missing implies a loss, and I wasn't sure I had lost anything so much as traded it, sometimes wisely, sometimes with too much change rattling in the pocket. He smiled, not at me but with me, as if the answer confirmed that the language we were speaking was mutually made. We drifted through memories and small admissions, stopping shy of confession. The blanket warmed my knees, night laid its palm on our shoulders. The porch light drew a few patient moths into its orbit. He told a short story about a train delay that turned into an accidental picnic on a platform, and I told one about a snowstorm that taught me which neighbors had shovels and which had patience. We did not touch. We did not even brush against the idea of touching. But the air, alert to both of us, began to lean. He turned toward me just slightly, the way people do when they are not sure whether to stand or stay seated inside a moment. I met his eyes long enough to acknowledge the crossroads. I could have stood then, said something tidy about early mornings and good rest. I could have told him that the chairs were old and tended to wobble. Instead, I remained where I was, letting the quiet choose its shape. There are decisions you make with your entire body before any one part of you moves. The breeze lifted a corner of the blanket and set it down again. A car passed, carrying unimportant music. I became aware of my own breathing the way you do in doctors' offices, counting each arrival and departure. I thought of my husband, his steady presence, the twine of our years, the way he can fix a hinge and a mood with equal patience. I thought of the way a life can be true and still leave certain rooms unvisited. The thought did not accuse, it simply stood up and looked at me. I turned, too. The distance between our chairs felt smaller than wood could measure. There was no speech to accompany what happened next, no draft of excuses or treaty of terms. There was the present tense, stripped of adverbs and apologies, as innocent and as complicated as a single verb. We kissed. Time resumed immediately afterward with its usual briskness, insolent in its certainty. We both sat back, and the night pretended it had not been holding its breath. I felt heat rise and recede like a blush correcting itself. I smoothed the blanket, then folded it over my knees, then unfolded it, an unnecessary choreography that gave my hands a task. He stared out toward the street, where nothing of note was happening. I could feel the shape of my choice settle into me without either triumph or panic, like a stone placed in a pocket by a shoreline walker who is not sure yet why they're keeping it. We didn't speak about it. There was no need and no courage for explanation. After a few more minutes, we stood as if summoned by the same quiet bell. I carried the blanket inside. He stacked the chairs. In the kitchen, I rinsed 2 glasses and set them upside down to dry. He said goodnight in a tone that respected both the day behind us and the one ahead. I answered with a nod that meant I heard him. The hallway received us again, parting and then closing like water. In my room, the bed was no less made than it had been the night before, but when I lay down, the mattress seemed to learn a new contour. I listened to the house assemble its nocturne, floorboards ticking as they remembered their trees, the whisper of leaves outside, the plant's small insistence on living. I tried to catalogue what had changed and found that I could not separate the inventory from the ache running through it. I am a married woman. I am a person who just crossed a line with a guest under my roof. Both sentences belong to me. Both insist on being said in the same breath. Sleep did not come quickly. It arrived the way someone arrives late to a meeting, apologizing with a gesture rather than words. When it finally took me, it brought a corridor of dreams where nothing dramatic occurred, only rooms with open windows and a sense that air itself had learned a new route through them. In the early blue that announces morning but doesn't rush it, I woke with the knowledge that ordinary would ask for me again and that I would answer as best I could, which is to say imperfectly, which is to say truthfully for who I am now. Morning unfolded slowly, as if the light itself was reluctant to enter the house. I woke earlier than usual, the residue of last night's moment still present, not as a vivid picture but as an alteration in the air. It clung to the edges of the hallway and lingered in the kitchen as I filled the kettle. I moved quietly, careful with each sound, the spoon against the mug, the creak of the floor, aware of the other presence still behind the closed door of the guest room. There was no plan for what should follow, there was only the ordinary day, waiting to be inhabited. When he came in, his expression was the same polite neutrality he had worn that first morning. His greeting was simple, his tone even, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the porch, the blanket, the warmth. We both pretended at the comfort of routine, him rinsing a cup before pouring coffee, me fussing with a bowl of fruit that didn't require fussing. The plant on the windowsill caught my attention again, its leaves slightly fuller than before, and I thought of how small things change when you aren't looking. After breakfast, he excused himself to work on some preparations for his project. I busied myself with a stack of laundry, moving between rooms in a quiet pattern. Folding shirts and matching socks felt almost like an act of contrition, an assertion that life still had its orderly, domestic heartbeat. But even as I worked, my mind returned to the same point, circling it like a restless bird. What did last night mean? And did it mean the same thing to both of us? I wasn't sure, and the uncertainty had its own kind of weight. Around midday, I found him in the yard, repairing the porch step he had inspected on his first day here. He worked steadily, his focus complete, and for a few minutes I watched from the kitchen window before stepping outside. The sun was mild, and the scent of freshly turned earth drifted from the small flower bed by the fence. I asked if he needed help, though my voice sounded lighter than I intended. He shook his head with a quick smile, saying it was nearly done. I stood there a little longer, the silence between us companionable but edged with the awareness of everything unspoken. The afternoon stretched in a calm, almost deliberate pace. We shared lunch without the formality of conversation, eating as people do when they have already filled the air with something else. I noticed the way he would occasionally look out the window, as if measuring the sky. I wondered whether he was thinking about the time he had left here, or whether he was simply considering the weather for a future walk. The ability to wonder about someone's thoughts is both a privilege and a quiet frustration. You are close enough to care but not close enough to know. Later, he asked if I wanted to walk to the park again. I agreed, and we left the house together, taking the side street where the pavement is uneven and forces you to watch your step. The trees along the route were beginning to show the faintest signs of seasonal change, a subtle shift in color that you might miss if you weren't looking closely. It reminded me that time was moving, whether we acknowledged it or not. In the park, we sat on a different bench this time, one with a view of the pond's far curve. The water was still, holding the reflection of the sky in an unbroken sheet. We talked about inconsequential things, how the air here felt different from other places he'd been, the quirks of the public transit system, the best time of day to buy bread before it sold out. But even these light exchanges carried an undercurrent, like a note sustained just beneath the melody. I found myself studying his gestures, the way he ran a hand over his knee before answering a question, or how he tilted his head slightly when listening. I was aware of my own posture, sitting straighter than usual, my hands resting in a stillness that felt deliberate. On the walk back, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain from somewhere not yet visible. The light shifted, and for a brief moment it felt as if the day was urging us to speak plainly. But neither of us did. Instead, We returned to the house and resumed our separate rhythms, he at the table with his laptop, me in the living room with a book I could not seem to follow. The words blurred, and I caught myself rereading the same paragraph several times. The weight of the unsaid seemed to settle over the furniture, soft but undeniable. In the evening, I made dinner while he set the table. The ease of working together was there, yet it felt different, more careful, as though we were each measuring the distance between our movements. We ate quietly, punctuating the silence with brief remarks about the food, the weather, the neighbor's new fence. I could feel the conversation pressing against the edges of something else, but I didn't push. Sometimes restraint is the only way to preserve what remains of the familiar. Afterward, I stood at the sink, rinsing plates under a thin stream of water. He joined me to dry them, the proximity bringing with it a subtle charge. We didn't touch, not even by accident, but I could feel the awareness of his presence in the narrowing space between us. When the last dish was put away, he thanked me and stepped back, leaving the kitchen with an unspoken gentleness. The night settled in, the kind that wraps the house in a calm you can almost hear. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the occasional car pass, its headlights sweeping briefly across the room. From the guest room came the muffled sound of movement, a drawer closing, the faint creak of the bed. I sipped slowly, letting the warmth linger on my tongue, and considered how quickly the ordinary can shift into something layered, something you carry without quite knowing its shape. Before going to bed, I checked the plant on the sill. Its leaves had spread a little wider, as if it had been quietly working all day. I touched the edge of one leaf, feeling its smooth resilience, and thought about how growth often happens without an audience. In the quiet that followed, I turned off the light and walked to my room, the hallway stretching ahead in its familiar narrowness. In bed, I listened for the house's nightly sounds, the settling of wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle of wind against the siding. Each noise felt amplified, as though the night itself was aware of my wakefulness. I thought about the porch, the park, the way we walked side by side without touching. I thought about my husband, away in another city, his routines unfolding in parallel to mine. And I thought about the space between what is allowed and what is possible, how thin that space can feel when you are living inside it. Sleep came late, arriving without ceremony. It brought with it a sense of suspended time, as if the hours between now and morning belonged to neither of us entirely. Somewhere in the distance, a branch tapped lightly against the window, and I drifted under, carrying the quiet weight of the day into dreams that left no trace. The morning began with the sound of rain against the roof, a steady rhythm that made the house feel smaller, more contained. I woke to the dim light filtering through the curtains, the edges of the room softened by the overcast sky. The rain was not heavy enough to keep people indoors entirely, but it was persistent, the kind that rewrites plans without asking permission. I lingered in bed longer than usual, listening to its unbroken pattern, feeling its quiet insistence seep into the walls. When I entered the kitchen, he was already there, standing by the counter with a mug in his hands. The smell of coffee hung in the air, richer for the dampness outside. He looked up briefly, offered a simple greeting, then returned his gaze to the rain tracing its way down the window. I poured myself tea, the steam rising to meet my face, and joined him in silence. The street beyond the glass was nearly empty, save for the occasional umbrella moving steadily along the pavement. There was a calm in the absence of motion, a pause in the usual hum of the day. We decided without speaking that it would be a day spent mostly indoors. I took a small satisfaction in that, there was no pressure to fill the hours with errands or distractions. The morning passed in fragments, him at the table with his laptop, me at the armchair with a book I was more skimming than reading. The rain provided a backdrop, constant enough to become invisible and yet shaping everything about the atmosphere. I noticed how he worked quietly, not tapping the keys in quick bursts but in measured intervals, as if each word or number he entered mattered. By midday, I felt the pull to be in the same room as him. Not for conversation, but for the unspoken comfort of shared space. I moved to the table under the pretext of sorting through papers, receipts, notes, and old letters I had meant to organize. He glanced at my growing pile and made a small comment about my system, and I replied with one about his meticulous arrangement of documents. The exchange was light, but it anchored us in the moment, a reminder that we were not merely two people occupying the same house, but two people noticing each other's habits. The afternoon brought a brief break in the rain, a thinning of clouds that let a muted brightness into the kitchen. He suggested we take advantage of it and go out for a short drive to a nearby town. It wasn't far, just enough to feel like we had stepped outside the day's boundaries. I agreed, and soon we were in the car, the windshield still dotted with the remnants of the storm. The road curved through fields that looked almost silver in the damp light, the grass bending under the weight of moisture. Small houses appeared and disappeared, their windows glowing faintly even in the day. We arrived in a town with a single main street lined with modest shops, each with its own narrow awning dripping with leftover rain. We walked slowly, glancing into store windows, occasionally pausing to comment on something, a row of mismatched mugs in a second-hand shop, a display of books in the front of a small library. In one bakery, the air was warm with the scent of bread fresh from the oven. We each chose something simple. He took a small loaf, I a pastry filled with apples. We ate outside under the shelter of the awning, the quiet punctuated by the sound of water dripping steadily from its edge. The drive back was quieter. The conversation, when it happened, was easy but sparse, as though both of us had agreed silently to let the rhythm of the day remain unbroken. Back at the house, the rain began again, softer this time, a fine mist that blurred the outlines of the street. I felt the familiar pull of routine and went into the kitchen to prepare dinner. He joined me without asking, moving easily between tasks, washing vegetables, setting plates on the table. The quiet cooperation between us was its own kind of conversation, a language made of small, deliberate movements. We ate as the rain tapped gently against the window. The meal was simple, but the act of sharing it felt substantial. I noticed how he sometimes paused before answering, as if considering not just the question but the shape of the answer. After dinner, we stayed at the table longer than usual, our conversation drifting between topics, places we had visited, foods we preferred, the small frustrations of daily life that are easier to share with someone not entangled in them. Later, we moved to the living room. I brought in 2 cups of tea, setting his down on the low table beside the couch where he had settled with a book. I took the armchair across from him. The rain had tapered to a light drizzle, the sound now more of a presence than an interruption. I watched the way the lamplight caught on the edge of his hair, the way his hand rested loosely on the open page. I told myself I was observing the scene, not the person, but I knew better. We stayed like that for a while, the room filled with the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be broken. Eventually, he closed his book and set it aside, glancing toward the window as if to confirm that the rain had truly stopped. I followed his gaze. The street was slick with water, reflecting the glow of the lamps. It felt like the day had folded in on itself, the edges meeting cleanly. When it was time to turn in, we moved through the familiar motions, lights switched off, cups rinsed, chairs pushed back into place. He said goodnight at the hallway, his voice calm, unmarked by anything that might betray more. I responded in kind, and we went to our separate rooms. In bed, the sound of the rain had already faded from memory, replaced by the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional soft groan of the house settling. I thought about the small town, the awnings dripping with rain, the shared meal, the quiet drive. They were ordinary things, strung together into the shape of a day. And yet, as I lay there in the dark, I knew I would remember them, not for what they were, but for how they felt, like standing at the edge of something you can't yet name, with the knowledge that the ground beneath you has already shifted. Morning arrived bright and rinsed, the kind of light that makes every surface confess its dust. I opened windows so the house could trade breaths with the street, curtains lifting like slow flags. Habit steadied my hands, straighten the mail, rinse the fruit bowl, wipe the banister until the wood answered with a muted glow. Beneath those motions, another pulse moved, quieter, unwilling to meet my eyes. I felt both hostess and trespasser inside my own routines. He entered the kitchen with the unremarkable grace of someone who knows how to be a guest. We exchanged brief greetings, poured tea, buttered toast, spoke of market hours and bus detours. When he offered to pick up groceries, I agreed too quickly, slowing my voice as if to correct it. He suggested the open-air market near the river. I said yes. We walked the long way so the errand could become a route. Our shadows kept polite distance. The market greeted us with clatter and spice, prices called out like verdicts, lids tapping glass. I weighed peaches by cent and heft. He compared bundles of basil as if each were a proposal. We shared a paper bag, its handles whispered against my wrist. Back home, bread crackled under the knife, tomatoes surrendered their sun, a wedge of cheese asked for patience. We ate by the window, letting the street perform, cyclists leaning into turns, a dog reconsidering a sit, a child dragging a kite that refused the sky. I watched his attention rest on small things, as if looking were a skill he meant to keep. After lunch he proposed a bus to the river path. I hesitated, performed the inventory of chores that make refusal look responsible, then nodded. The bus arrived with its practiced sigh. We sat near the middle where people forget to look. The city moved past, brick to wood to glass, laundry with public courage, a man watering a sapling with a cup refilled 5 times. The river met us with light stitched into ripples and wind that kept its own counsel. We followed the path between water and warehouse, passing joggers, a teenager rehearsing a dance, a fisherman leaning toward patience. He pointed out a mural I had never noticed, a caravan of painted animals crossing a shuttered factory. The colors had outlived the company that paid for them. We paused at a railing while the bridge threw its spine from bank to bank. A barge moved past, unglamorous and steady. He asked whether a new street could change the angle of a life. I said I once wanted a coastline and learned instead to collect other seas, fields at dusk, libraries at opening, the hush before applause. We stood in the wind, trading maps no one else would read. Leaves skated along the asphalt as the sky darkened. We turned slowly toward the city. At a corner, an old loading dock offered a shallow overhang. Rain arrived in clean, quick sentences, turning pavement to mirror. We stood under the shelter, a forearm's length apart, watching the street shine. The smell of wet dust rose. He pushed his hands into his pockets and exhaled. I thought of my husband's winter laugh, of a day we moved the sofa and learned the room worked better off-center. I thought of steadiness as an art. He turned toward me as if answering a question I hadn't asked. The rain complicated the light. I knew the ledger, love, vows, years stitched into quilts and calendars. I am not careless with arithmetic. And yet the shelter narrowed the future into a present so exact it left no room for footnotes. I became aware of the places my body keeps doubt, the hinge of the jaw, the ridge beneath the ribs, the space between shoulder blades where breath pauses. We kissed. It belonged to the moment because nothing else would. It did not declare or promise. It felt like weather on skin, undeniable, not eternal. When we stepped back, the world kept raining. A bus hissed past. I swallowed and tasted something like honey, or only the idea of morning returning. We walked to the stop, studied the schedule as if it might explain us. On the ride home we sat across an aisle, the distance feeling less like caution than clarity. Through the window, the city shifted, iron to ivy, brick to billboard, strangers to reflections and back again. I learned nothing new about him in those minutes and everything necessary about myself, that the line I guard is also a door. At home we shelved groceries with the care of archivists. I wrote a note to water the plant, then did it immediately. Evening arrived without ceremony. I made a soup that asked only to be stirred. He set the table, folded napkins into shy triangles, chose the cracked bowl for olives. We ate like neighbors who had watched the same storm from different windows. After dishes, I turned on lamps as if soft light could lay gentler rules. He stood on the veranda, looking not at the sky but at the lattice the streetlights wove through leaves. I joined him and mentioned tomorrow's forecast. He replied about an early meeting. Our sentences chose their chairs and sat politely. Before bed I sorted the day into safe containers, receipts in the jar, keys on the dish, thoughts folded and hidden. In the mirror I saw a woman whose life still fit, and another whose edges asked for air. I washed my face, applied the balm that keeps small promises, and told the quiet to behave. It did until the light went out, then resumed its work, counting, measuring, adjusting the frame until sleep arrived. The day began with the sound of a delivery truck idling outside, its low hum weaving through my half-sleep until it finally moved on. Light came in unhurried, bending around the curtains, revealing the familiar contours of the room. I rose slowly, the air cool against my skin, and dressed with the same sequence of movements I have followed for years. The house greeted me with its ordinary stillness, no scent of brewing coffee yet, no footsteps in the hallway, just the faint click of the refrigerator cycling on. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The flame's steady whisper was the first real sound of the morning. He appeared a few minutes later, hair still unsettled from sleep, offering a soft good morning before moving toward the cupboard for a mug. The exchange was brief, almost procedural, but I noticed how his voice seemed to carry a trace of something unspoken, a gentleness that had not been there in the early days of his stay. We moved through breakfast with a quiet efficiency, tea poured, toast buttered, fruit sliced and divided without comment. There was a kind of choreography to it, the passing of plates and the brushing of fingers against handles, all performed without drawing attention to the space between us. When the dishes were cleared, he mentioned needing to spend a few hours preparing for an upcoming meeting. I nodded, saying I had things to tend to as well, though I wasn't entirely sure what those things would be. The morning stretched out in separate rhythms. He worked at the table, his laptop open, a page of notes beside it filled in a looping, precise handwriting. I moved from room to room, dusting surfaces that barely needed attention, straightening bookshelves already in order. It was less about the tasks themselves and more about creating the illusion of purpose, something to keep my hands occupied while my mind drifted toward thoughts I tried not to name. By late morning, the sunlight had grown warmer, pooling on the floorboards and tempting the windows open. I stepped outside to the small back garden, where the air smelled faintly of damp earth from the previous day's rain. The leaves held a brighter green under the sun, and I felt the familiar tug of wanting to be anywhere that allowed for open air and the absence of walls. I stayed out longer than I intended, trimming a few stray branches and pulling weeds that had made their quiet return. When I came back inside, he was still at the table but had shifted his focus, leaning back slightly with his pen resting idle. He asked if I wanted to take a break and walk to the bakery before the lunch crowd arrived. I agreed without hesitation. The street was bright, with just enough breeze to keep the warmth from settling too heavily. We walked in an easy pace, side by side but leaving that same deliberate space between us. The bakery was fragrant with yeast and cinnamon, and we chose a loaf still warm from the oven along with 2 small tarts, wrapped carefully in paper. We decided to bring the food back and eat on the veranda. The bread cracked softly under the knife, steam escaping in small clouds. We ate without rush, the sun filtering through the overhead vines, casting shifting patterns on the table. There was no heavy conversation, just the occasional remark about the bread's texture, the crispness of the tart, the way the breeze carried the faint sound of someone's radio from down the street. After lunch, the hours drifted again into a comfortable quiet. I read in the living room while he worked nearby, our shared silence broken only by the occasional turning of a page or the muted tapping of keys. It was the kind of afternoon where time seems to fold in on itself, the minutes blending into a soft blur. As the day leaned toward evening, he closed his laptop and suggested we play one of the board games stacked on the shelf in the hallway. I hesitated, then agreed, bringing the box into the living room. We set it up on the coffee table, the pieces clicking lightly as they found their places. The game required focus, but it also invited conversation in small, unguarded fragments. We laughed at each other's missteps, traded quiet strategies, and let the time pass without marking it. At one point, his hand brushed mine as we both reached for the same piece. It was a fleeting contact, gone almost before it could be registered, yet it left an echo that lingered longer than reason allowed. I steadied my focus on the board, forcing the moment back into the flow of the game. Still, I could feel its outline in the air between us. The game ended with no clear victory, the outcome secondary to the act of playing. We returned the pieces to their compartments, closed the box, and set it back in its place. The lamps were switched on as the daylight began to thin, their warm glow softening the edges of the room. I moved to the kitchen to prepare dinner, and he joined me without asking, chopping vegetables while I tended to the pan. The rhythm of cooking together was easier now, each of us anticipating the other's movements, stepping aside when needed, filling the spaces without instruction. We ate at the table, the meal simple but satisfying. The conversation was light, small comments about the day, an observation about the weather turning cooler in the evenings, a passing mention of something he'd read earlier. There was a steadiness in it, a reminder that not every moment needed to hold weight. After the dishes were washed and dried, we returned to the veranda. The street was quieter now, the last of the daylight fading into the soft hues of dusk. A few windows across the way glowed with the yellow light of other people's evenings. We sat without speaking for a long while, the air carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. It was not an uncomfortable silence, rather, it was the kind that comes when words would only distract from the completeness of the moment. Eventually, we rose, each taking a different direction down the hallway. I entered my room, the familiar shape of it greeting me as though nothing had changed. And yet, as I moved through the simple motions of preparing for bed, I was aware of a subtle shift, something unmeasured but undeniable, a quiet rearranging of the spaces between us. When I turned out the light, the house settled into its nighttime cadence, and I lay awake for a time, listening, as if the answers to questions I had not asked might arrive in the dark. The morning broke clear and sharp, sunlight spilling into the kitchen before I had even stepped inside. The air carried the freshness of a night without rain, a subtle promise that the day might stretch longer than usual. I moved through the opening rituals, kettle on, mug set out, fruit rinsed, feeling the rhythm of a house that had begun to fold someone else's presence into its daily pattern. He entered a few minutes later, his greeting warm but brief, his hair slightly tousled as though he had risen quickly. We spoke about nothing in particular, the kind of morning talk that feels more like a shared acknowledgement of the day ahead than a true exchange. After breakfast, he mentioned needing to run an errand in the city center. I had planned to stay home, but he asked if I wanted to join him, adding that we could stop somewhere for lunch. I agreed without overthinking, curious about how the day might shape itself if I allowed it to. We left the house together, walking the familiar route to the bus stop. The sunlight followed us, settling on the pavement in soft patches filtered through the leaves. The city center was already awake when we arrived. Vendors were setting up stalls, buses exhaled at each corner, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a bakery whose window held a line of pastries too neatly arranged to be ignored. He took care of his errand quickly, a package picked up from a small shop, and then we wandered without a fixed destination. We passed a bookstore, and he slowed to glance at the display. I waited as he browsed for a few minutes, his hand running along the spines in a way that suggested he read titles like they were quiet invitations. By midday, we found a cafe tucked into a side street, its tables small and close together, the kind of place where conversations feel protected by the hum of the room. We ordered simple dishes and sat by the window, watching the flow of people outside. The food was good, but it was the unhurried pace that stayed with me, the way each small moment seemed to carry more weight than its size allowed. He asked about the years I had worked downtown, and I told him stories about familiar corners now changed, about the old newsstand that once stood where a clothing store now was. He listened with the attentiveness of someone piecing together a map. When we finished, we lingered over the last sips of our drinks before heading back toward the bus stop. The return trip was quieter, the kind of silence that comes not from a lack of words but from the ease of not needing them. The bus hummed steadily beneath us, the city slipping by in a sequence of windows, shop signs, and the occasional glance from a fellow passenger. Back at the house, the afternoon light had shifted, stretching shadows across the hallway floor. We put away the small items we brought back, then settled into separate corners of the living room, he with a book, me with the stack of letters I had been meaning to sort. The hours moved gently, punctuated only by the occasional sound of turning pages or the creak of a chair. I noticed how the quiet felt different now than it had in the first days of his stay, not heavy, but deliberate, as though the silence itself had agreed to keep our company. Later, he suggested we take a short walk before dinner. The air outside was cooler, the heat of the day having thinned into something more forgiving. We followed the path toward the park, the gravel crunching underfoot. Children played in the distance, their laughter carried in uneven bursts by the breeze. We walked along the pond's edge, where the water mirrored the muted colors of the early evening sky. A pair of ducks moved lazily across its surface, leaving ripples that widened without hurry. On the way back, we stopped at the small grocery to pick up a few things for dinner. The shop was nearly empty, the hum of the refrigerator cases the loudest sound. We chose vegetables, bread, and a bottle of something to share. The cashier's greeting was polite but distracted, her eyes already turning toward the next customer in line. We carried the bags home together, the handles cutting slightly into my palms, grounding me in the physicality of the moment. In the kitchen, we moved easily around each other, the earlier weeks of tentative coordination now replaced by an unspoken rhythm. I chopped onions while he prepared the salad, the sounds of our work mingling with the occasional scrape of a knife or the clink of a bowl. The smell of the meal began to fill the house, curling through the hallway and softening the edges of the day. We ate at the table, the conversation light, moving between observations about the walk and small plans for the next day. After the dishes were done, he suggested we sit in the living room for a while. The lamps cast a warm light over the room, and outside the windows the street had grown quiet. We talked about music, about the places we wanted to see someday, about books that had stayed with us long after we finished them. At some point, the conversation slowed, the pauses lengthening into something that felt like a separate language. We were no longer just exchanging words, we were holding the space between them. I became aware of how close we were sitting, how the warmth of his presence seemed to settle into the space around me. My thoughts moved in two directions at once, one toward the comfort of the familiar, the other toward the pull of something less defined but no less real. I didn't plan what happened next, it was not a decision made in the mind but in the moment itself. We spent the night together. The hours that followed passed in a quiet that felt almost outside of time. There was no discussion of what it meant, no attempt to name it. When morning arrived, it did so gently, the light slipping into the room as if reluctant to disturb the stillness. We moved through breakfast with care, not avoiding each other but not lingering either. The day awaited us, unchanged in its structure but altered in ways that would not be easily undone. As I cleared the table, I felt the weight of what had shifted, not as regret, but as the awareness that the line between one life and another is thinner than we allow ourselves to believe. The rest of the day lay ahead, filled with its ordinary tasks, yet I knew that something unspoken would move with us through each of them, as present as the air we breathed. The morning after passed quietly, as though the house had absorbed our silence and was intent on holding it. I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, the familiar tasks feeling heavier in my hands. The kettle took longer to boil than usual, or maybe it was just me noticing time differently. He joined me not long after, greeting me in the same tone he always had. His voice didn't carry any trace of the night before, and I followed his lead, responding in kind. We ate breakfast without ceremony, the scrape of cutlery and the clink of mugs filling the space where conversation might have been. When the dishes were done, he retreated to the table with his laptop, settling into the kind of focus that leaves little room for interruption. I stood in the doorway for a moment before deciding to step outside. The air was cooler than expected, carrying the faint scent of rain that had passed sometime before dawn. The street was nearly empty, just a few early risers walking dogs or heading toward the bus stop. I took a short walk, circling the block, letting the rhythm of my steps work against the clutter in my mind. By the time I returned, the house felt different, still quiet, but with a slight undercurrent, like the faint hum of a machine you can't locate. He looked up briefly when I came in, offering a quick smile before turning back to his work. I went about my own tasks, sorting laundry, making the bed, dusting shelves that didn't need dusting. The normalcy of these movements was grounding, but every so often my thoughts strayed back to the same point, replaying it without finding a conclusion. In the early afternoon, the neighbor knocked at the door. She wanted to borrow a small kitchen tool, and I invited her in for a few minutes while I found it. She stood in the kitchen chatting about a community event and the possibility of rain later in the week. I nodded and responded when needed, but part of my attention was aware of him in the other room, the sound of his chair shifting as he worked. When she left, I placed the borrowed item on her porch rather than risk another conversation. The rest of the afternoon unfolded slowly. He suggested making lunch together, and I agreed. We prepared a simple meal, working side by side without needing to speak much. The routine of chopping, stirring, and plating food felt almost like a truce, a return to something safer. We ate at the table, the conversation confined to neutral topics, the weather, a book he had read, a local shop he thought might be worth visiting. It was as if we were both careful not to step too close to the edge of something we couldn't easily name. After lunch, I retreated to the living room with a book. The words blurred on the page, my attention drifting toward the sound of him typing in the other room. I caught myself listening for pauses, for signs of movement, as if they might reveal something unspoken. Eventually, I set the book down and turned my gaze to the window, watching the slow sway of branches outside. The day had settled into a kind of suspended state, neither moving forward nor holding still. Later, he asked if I wanted to take a short drive to the next town over. There was no pressing reason to go, but the idea of movement appealed to me. We left in the mid-afternoon, the road unfolding in long stretches of green fields and quiet intersections. The drive was companionable, the radio playing softly in the background. We didn't talk much, but the silence felt less like avoidance and more like an understanding that words weren't necessary for every mile. The town was small, its main street lined with a handful of shops and a single cafe. We walked for a while, browsing through a store that sold a mix of antiques and household goods. He pointed out an old clock, saying it reminded him of one his grandparents had owned. I nodded, tracing the shape of the frame with my eyes. We didn't linger in any one place for long, instead letting the walk be the purpose in itself. Before leaving, we stopped at the cafe for coffee, sitting outside under a striped awning. The breeze carried the faint scent of baked goods from inside, and for a moment, the day felt almost ordinary. The drive back was quieter. The sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. I watched the fields pass by, the occasional farmhouse standing solitary against the horizon. My thoughts moved between the familiarity of the landscape and the awareness that the time we had in this arrangement was limited. I didn't know exactly when it would end, but the certainty of its eventual conclusion hung in the back of my mind. Back at the house, the evening routines began almost automatically. I prepared dinner while he took care of small repairs around the porch. The sound of tools being set down carried through the open window, mingling with the smell of the food cooking on the stove. When he came inside, he washed his hands at the kitchen sink without a word, then began setting the table. We worked in parallel, each movement fitting into the other without discussion. We ate while the last of the daylight faded, the lamplight taking over as the main source of warmth in the room. Conversation came in short stretches, enough to keep the air moving but not enough to reveal much beneath the surface. When the meal was over, we cleaned up together, the clatter of dishes punctuating the otherwise steady quiet. Afterward, he suggested we sit outside for a while. The night air was cooler now, the street lights casting a soft glow across the pavement. We sat with a small table between us, each with a cup in hand. The sound of distant traffic reached us in waves, rising and falling like a tide. At one point, he asked if I had plans for the following day. I answered simply, mentioning a few errands and the possibility of visiting the market. He nodded, and the conversation tapered off again. Eventually, we went back inside, the hallway stretching between our rooms. I paused at my door, glancing toward his, but neither of us said anything. In my room, I moved through the familiar motions of preparing for bed, each step deliberate. The house settled around me, its nighttime rhythm unchanged. I lay in the quiet, aware of the weight the day had carried, a weight made not of events but of everything unsaid. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it felt like stepping into water, the surface closing gently above me. The morning began with a low fog that softened the edges of everything outside the windows. The garden looked smaller under its cover, the street quieter than usual, as if the day itself was hesitant to start. I moved through the kitchen in slow, deliberate motions, filling the kettle, laying out mugs, slicing bread, aware of the silence between each action. When he entered, his greeting was warm enough, but his expression carried a thought he hadn't voiced. I didn't ask. We stood side by side for a few minutes, preparing breakfast with the unspoken coordination we had developed over his time here. After we ate, he mentioned needing to make a few calls for his project. His tone was casual, but there was a weight to it I couldn't quite place. I took that as my cue to keep to my own tasks. I swept the porch, watered the plants, and reorganized a shelf in the living room that didn't need reorganizing. Each small job gave my hands something to do, but my mind moved elsewhere, circling around the quiet shift I felt in him. It wasn't distance exactly, but it was something close. By late morning, he was in the guest room with the door partly closed, speaking softly into his phone. I caught fragments of his words when I passed down the hallway, enough to gather that he was discussing plans beyond the scope of his stay here. I kept moving, pretending not to notice. In the kitchen, I prepared a light lunch, the kind of meal that could be eaten without much conversation if that was how the afternoon unfolded. When we did sit down to eat, our words stayed in safe territory, how mild the weather had been lately, the small changes happening in the neighborhood, a recipe I once learned from a friend. He listened politely, offering a few short replies, but his attention seemed split. I didn't press him. We finished the meal and cleared the table, moving around each other with care, as though the space between us was more fragile than it had been the day before. The afternoon light thinned early, the fog never fully lifting. I settled into the armchair with a book, though I couldn't follow the plot. Across the room, he was at the table again, laptop open, typing in short bursts. Now and then, he would stop, stare out the window, and then return to the keys. It was a quiet that didn't feel entirely shared. The rhythm of the house had changed, and I couldn't decide if I was imagining it or simply noticing something that had been there all along. Around mid-afternoon, he closed his laptop and suggested a walk. I agreed, relieved for a chance to move. The streets were damp from the morning mist, the air carrying the faint smell of wet leaves. We didn't speak much as we walked, our footsteps falling into an even cadence. At the park, we followed the path around the pond, the water still enough to hold the reflection of the overcast sky. A group of children were feeding ducks near the edge, their laughter carrying across the water in bright bursts. We stood for a while watching them before turning back toward home. On the return walk, he asked if I had been to a particular cafe in town. I told him I had years ago, but not recently. He said we should go before he leaves. The words landed more heavily than he might have intended, not because they were dramatic but because they confirmed something I had been trying not to name. He didn't specify when he would be leaving, but the shape of the moment made it clear that it was sooner rather than later. Back at the house, the rest of the afternoon slipped by in muted patterns. He worked again. I folded laundry and listened to the soft hum of the washing machine. The sound seemed to fill the house more than our voices did. When the last load was done, I stacked the folded clothes neatly and carried them to the appropriate rooms, lingering a moment at the doorway of the guest room before setting his things inside. Evening came quietly. I began dinner, chopping vegetables with deliberate care, listening to the small rhythm of the knife against the cutting board. He joined me partway through, taking over the salad without being asked. We worked without much conversation, the familiar comfort of our shared kitchen tasks tempered by the awareness that there wouldn't be many more evenings like this. The meal was simple, but neither of us seemed interested in making it more than it was. We ate slowly, speaking of practical things, errands, a repair the porch steps might need before winter, the market schedule for the coming week. There was nothing in the words themselves, but the pauses between them felt telling. After we finished, we cleared the table together, washing and drying the dishes in the same practiced order we had settled into weeks ago. Later, we sat in the living room, each in our own chair, the lamplight casting small pools of warmth. I leafed through a magazine without really seeing it, my thoughts elsewhere. He stared at the bookshelf for a long moment before picking up one of the novels I had left there. We read in silence until the hour grew late enough that the day felt ready to close. When I rose to head toward my room, he looked up and said softly that he might have to leave sooner than expected. I nodded, keeping my face steady, answering only with a quiet "I see." There was no elaboration, no explanation beyond that, and none was asked for. We said goodnight at the hallway, our voices carrying the same evenness they had that morning, though the air between us held more than words could manage. In my room, I moved through my nightly routine with a focus that bordered on mechanical. I folded my clothes neatly, placed a glass of water on the nightstand, adjusted the curtains so the outside light wouldn't spill in. Lying in bed, I listened to the faint sounds of the house settling, the creak of the floor, the distant hum of a passing car, and tried to imagine what the next few days might look like. The image wouldn't settle into anything clear. Sleep came in uneven stretches, the kind that leaves you aware of the hours even as they pass. The morning arrived without rush, the light pale and even, casting no strong shadows. I rose earlier than usual, as if waking ahead of the day might allow me to catch something before it slipped away. The kitchen felt cooler than normal, the tiles underfoot holding the memory of the night's air. I boiled water, sliced bread, and moved through the motions of breakfast with a quiet precision. The stillness in the house was unbroken until I heard his steps in the hallway. His greeting was steady, almost practiced, and I returned it in the same measured way. We ate without hurry, speaking about the weather and the likelihood of rain in the coming days. After breakfast, he mentioned he had some things to pack. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of confirmation. I nodded, and he left the kitchen. I stood at the sink for a while after he was gone, rinsing the same cup more times than necessary, my eyes fixed on the window but seeing little of the view. The street outside was waking in its own slow manner. A cyclist passed, a delivery van stopped briefly, a neighbor bent to pick up their newspaper. By mid-morning, the sound of movement from the guest room was steady, the faint thud of a drawer closing, the rustle of fabric being folded, the quiet drag of a zipper. I stayed in the living room, giving him space, sorting through a small stack of papers that didn't really need sorting. Every so often, I heard his steps crossing the hall, carrying something to the door. The rhythm of departure had begun, and the house seemed to recognize it. Near noon, he came into the living room carrying a small bag and asked if I wanted to walk with him to the bus station. I agreed, knowing I would have regretted letting him go alone. We left the house together, the air outside warmer than I had expected, with a faint breeze that moved the leaves just enough to catch the light. Our steps matched without effort, the quiet between us no longer heavy but measured, as though we were both aware of the limited distance left. The walk took us through familiar streets, past the bakery where we had bought bread, the corner where the bus to the river stopped, the small park with its worn benches. I noticed each landmark as if trying to fix them in place, though they had been there long before him and would remain after. When we reached the station, the bus was not yet in sight. We stood off to the side, out of the flow of people arriving and leaving. The conversation was light, a mention of the route he would take, a brief comment about the quietness of the day. I found myself watching the horizon for the bus, not because I wanted it to come sooner, but because I couldn't stop myself. When it did arrive, the moment unfolded without ceremony. He thanked me for everything, his words brief but clear. I told him to take care, keeping my voice steady. There was no drawn-out goodbye. He stepped onto the bus, found a seat, and set his bag down. I stayed where I was, watching as the driver closed the doors and the bus pulled away. The sound of it faded quickly, leaving only the low hum of the street around me. The walk back to the house felt longer, though I followed the same route. Without him beside me, the spaces we had filled together seemed more obvious, the empty stretch past the park, the corner where we would pause to let a car pass, the brief shadow under the bakery awning. When I reached the house, I let myself in quietly, though there was no one to disturb. The rooms felt larger, the air settled. I moved through the house slowly, noticing the absence in small ways, the guest room bed neatly made but with no bag at its foot, the chair at the kitchen table pushed in just slightly more than usual, the folded blanket on the veranda untouched since the evening before. I watered the plant on the windowsill, its leaves still catching the afternoon light, and thought about the day he had placed it there. It seemed steadier than I felt. The rest of the afternoon passed in a kind of muted order. I did the laundry, swept the floor, and prepared a simple dinner for one. The quiet no longer pressed against me, but it was different from the quiet before he came, emptier in some places, fuller in others. As the evening settled, I opened the windows to let in the cooling air. The streetlights flickered on, casting their familiar pattern across the walls. Later, I sat on the veranda with a cup of tea, looking out at the street. A few neighbors passed, some nodding in greeting, others too absorbed in their own thoughts to notice. I let the tea cool in my hands, the warmth fading but the comfort of holding it remaining. The night moved at its own pace, unhurried, the way it had before his arrival. When I finally went inside, I turned off the lights one by one, the house returning to its nighttime shape. In my room, I set the cup down on the nightstand and stood for a moment, listening to the stillness. There was no conclusion waiting, no sudden clarity. What had happened would remain as it was, a series of days, of walks, of shared meals and unspoken understandings. It would not be written into anything larger, nor would it vanish entirely. I lay down, pulling the blanket over me, and felt the familiar weight of the house settle around me. The air was cool, the room dark. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its headlights briefly sweeping across the ceiling before disappearing. I closed my eyes, knowing that tomorrow the routines would begin again, not exactly as before, but close enough to find their shape. The days ahead would carry their own rhythm, and I would learn to move with it.